Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, and we're going to talk about a Dungeons and Dragons interview, in my humble opinion. There's a ton of things that happen in the world that are about nothing but Dungeons and Dragons, and but the rest of the world doesn't see it, right? And one of these just happened. So I listened to Neil Brennan's podcast. He does a fantastic job of interviewing people. It's usually an hour to an hour and 20 minutes. And he prepares very well. He gets good questions ready, and he is wicked smart, right? And so he can not only does he bring good questions, but he can actually adapt in the moment, right, to whatever's going on with the guest. And he actually does his research so he knows who the guest is before they come in. So recently he had on Dungeons and Dragons creator Dan Harmon. And you're like, wait a second, didn't he make Rick and Morty? Yes. What do you think the Dungeons and Dragons Rick and Morty box is? It's core canon. Core canon. It galls me that stupid. Sorry, I don't want to say stupid. Apologies. It galls me that Rick and Morty jumped the line. Like, why don't we have, Dungeons and Dragons Star Wars? Why don't we have, why on earth? No one asked for this. Nobody wants this. Nobody wants this. Nobody wanted the Rick and Morty Dungeons and Dragons box. And the fact that that product exists, and Dungeons and Dragons, Dungeons and Dragons Fast and Furious, right? And Dungeons and Dragons Salem's Lot, and a million properties that, that we want don't exist. And this ridiculous product is core canon, right? So Dan Harmon is an actual Dungeons and Dragons creator. He has canon content in Dungeons and Dragons, right? So Neil Brennan brings him on, and you have got to see this to witness it, but I'm going to try to explain to you what happened. So basically, I've never seen anything like this, and you haven't either, right? So both these men are millionaires. Both of them are outrageously smart, right? But the other thing is they're both Hollywood, which means that they have each of them has 10 years minimum, a full decade of not having to give an F about anybody but themselves. And I think both of them do have, neither one of them have married anybody, right? And neither one of them have a child of their own, right? Now, Neil Brennan, actually, his girlfriend has a child, so like asterisk, whatever you want to call that. But both of these guys are childless from their own genesis, right? Both of these guys have carefully avoided marrying anyone. And you're looking at two guys who have spent a decade with enough money to not care about anybody in the world but themselves. These are social predators. These guys are claws and fangs out, absolute monster humans, right? This is the pinnacle of I do not give an F about anybody else on this planet, right? But I'm also smart enough to understand how to function socially. And both of them, Neil Brennan's okay, I want to do a podcast. I know if I get Dan Harmon on, I'm going to get a ton of views because of Community and Rick and Morty, right? And then Dan Harmon's I got an agent, and I got to behave like a regular human being, and I got to keep the ball moving, so I got to be on this podcast. Well, Dan Harmon normally goes on to a podcast and just get, and people fluff his pillows and are like, hey, whatever you need, you're the best, Dan. And Dan is like, oh yeah, of course I'm the best, man. Let's rock it. Let's talk an hour about me and how awesome I am, and just have a big long talk about how awesome Community and Rick and Morty is. And that's not what Neil Brennan did. He came in and he just bangers. Real question, right? Getting right to the core of what he wanted to know and asking real questions, right? And it is I've never seen anything like it, right? These guys despise each other, but they completed the podcast. And it's a banger. It's an amazing podcast that everyone should listen to, even though both people absolutely despise each other and have zero respect for the other person on the other side, right? And so once you get that all down and you understand that, then you reach the point of, wait a second, seriously, why do we need friends at the Dungeons and Dragons table? Can't we just have people who hate each other? Right? Like, isn't it possible that if we get people we hate to play Dungeons and Dragons with, it's going to be the best Dungeons and Dragons campaign ever? And honestly, it's an amazing podcast. There's a lot of wisdom. Every line that's heard, it's so compelling. And not just their hatred for each other is highly compelling because they have to function through to complete the podcast. It doesn't end short. Both of them do the task, right? And there's so much fascinating content in it and so many things to think about. It's very real, astonishingly real, right? Very, very fascinating. You got to watch this thing. Every single word you just heard is my humble opinion. The important part is when I get to hear your humble opinion. When you get in the comments and send your traffic, please consider liking and subscribing, and have a fetch millennium.